Molly in a bag. Unlike today, when Christmas hype starts around mid-October, lining up alongside that already in place promoting Halloween, the simpler days of the late 1940s saw no such activity until the second week of December. At least that's what I recall, because my birthday, the first week of December, took precedence over anything else. In December 1947, having just celebrated my 8th birthday, Christmas was just weeks away. World peace had only been in place for 2 years, but the conflagration of World War II was still large in people's minds. My grandfather had died the previous year, accidentally drowning in the St. Lawrence while on a test cruise of a Corvette minesweeper which had been built in the Collingwood shipyard. Despite this loss, my grandmother, a resilient and determined old gal, having raised 7 children to adulthood predominantly on her own, wanted family around her this Christmas, and so it came to pass. My mother, father, sister, and I, all my uncles, aunts, and cousins, along with 2 Brit boarders she had taken in, were in attendance. Some gifts were exchanged during the course of events, but the primary focus seemed to be on my father's gift for my mother, which was the last to be given. There seemed to be great anticipation for this gift-giving, as everyone apparently knew what was to transpire. As my father momentarily disappeared to retrieve the gift from its hiding place, my mother was sat down, somewhat confused, as everyone gathered around her. My father reappeared carrying a large brown paper bag and plunked it on my mother's lap. Something in the bag moved, and my mother dropped the bag to the floor, a look of horror on her face. There was a wee yelp from the bag, and those gathered around began to laugh and ooh and ah as a little puppy with soft black curly fur slowly emerged from the bag. It seems everyone present, except my mother, my sister, and I, had known in advance what the gift was, and they were anxious to see the reaction. My father had picked the puppy up from the breeder the week before and prevailed on my grandmother to take care of it until the Christmas gathering. It was well known that my mother had a fear of dogs, and this was my father's way of helping her to overcome it, he having been raised with a dog. Plus, who could not fall in love with a cute little puppy? Only a few moments passed before my mother had it in her arms, cuddling it while trying to avoid its attempt to lick her face. It was by far the gift that drew the most attention that Christmas. As we settled back home that evening with a new member of the immediate family, naming the pup was next in order. My grandfather had been born and raised in Scotland. His father, my great-grandfather, had been born in Ireland, emigrating to Scotland during the potato famine. The pup was a purebred Kerry Blue Terrier, the breed originating in Ireland. So the christening was easy. Our new family member became known around the house as Molly Malone, or simply Molly in the neighborhood, as she endeared herself to all who met her. Molly was of noble birth, per her pedigree recorded in the Canadian Kennel Club stud book, which lists her official name as Deep Blue of Erith. It also lists her parentage as Sire, Invader of Erith, and Dam, Wembley's Glamour Girl. The registration also goes on to name her sires and Dam's parentage, as well as their parentage, Molly's grandparents and great-grandparents. It's quite an extensive and impressive listing. Molly was born October 18, 1947, and sold to my father on December 15th. The question asked was why the breeder sold Molly when she was such pedigreed parentage. The answer was simply that Molly had a defect that precluded her as show material as well as for further breeding, and we were the beneficiaries. With his background and knowledge of a dog's needs, my father took the initial responsibility for Molly's training and feeding. At the appropriate age, he also had her spayed. As friendly, happy, and playful as she was, she seemed to become more so after the operation. No question, she was much loved. As Molly reached her first year with her new family, I had just turned 9, deemed by my father to be the age of responsibility, and I became the primary dog walker. I walked her around the neighborhood, and we were always greeted with smiles and a few pats for Molly. I often took her to the local park to play fetch and just let her run free. She always returned obediently when called. We developed a strong bond. The local park was host to an annual fair, and one year they had a best dressed dog contest, and I entered Molly. I dressed her in a cowboy outfit, complete with cowboy hat. We won hands down and were awarded a shiny silver dollar for the effort. It certainly helped to have a crowd of neighbors who knew her, hollering, "Molly, Molly, Molly." One thing about Molly that totally amazed me was her intuitive ability. My mother had started working, requiring round trip to and from her job with the TTC. Her arrival home was quite consistent, so I would take Molly for a walk, ending up at the TTC stop where my mother usually descended from the streetcar. Molly would sit patiently as one streetcar after another stopped and then moved on. After 3 or 4 had passed, Molly would suddenly stand, tail wagging, as a streetcar a block away approached. As it stopped and the doors opened, my mother stepped off. It was all I could do to hold Molly back in her excitement to see my mother. The scene as it unfolded was to become almost a daily ritual, much to the amazement of the whole family. Just one other attribute that endeared Molly as being very special. I missed Molly a great deal when I was sent to summer camp. My parents visited on the weekend, bringing Molly with them. I would see them coming, and as they opened the car door, Molly would bound out and race right for me, tail wagging and tongue lollygagging. She jumped into my arms and licked my face in a frenzy. It was the following year, my last year at camp, that I experienced the saddest day of my life. Awaiting my parents' arrival for a visit, anticipating that Molly and I would go through our meet and greet routine, I was disappointed when the car door opened. And no Molly. I asked, "Where's Molly?" My father took my hand and led me to a bench and said, "I have something to tell you, son." As we sat, I queried again with anxiety in my voice, "Where's Molly?" "Molly is no longer with us, my boy. She passed away just a few days ago." I could hear no more. I bolted from the bench and ran and ran and ran, tears blinding me as I ran in no particular direction. With the emotion of the moment mostly expended, I returned to my father, still seated on the bench. I sat beside him, and with his arm around me, he told me what had happened. Of course, I knew that 2 years prior, while staying at a cottage at Wasaga Beach, Molly had been struck by a delivery van on the sand roadway. She was carried unconscious to the cottage and was laid on a blanket. In about 30 minutes she began to stir, and in another 10 she was on her feet, seemingly none the worse for the accident. However, as my father told it, in the past week Molly had lost her equilibrium. She was walking into walls and falling regularly. A visit to the vet determined that Molly had a brain tumor, possibly caused by the accident 2 years ago. Unfortunately, there was no saving her, and she was put to sleep. She was only 4 years old, but in those 4 years, I learned what true love is, or rather was. Molly was the love of my life, and no subsequent replacement, and there were 2 of them over time, could ever replace Molly in my heart.